Hello, everyone. It's lovely to have you here. I'm here with an amazing group of speakers. So we're joined by Anne Whitehat from Lower Levy. Anne is a plaintiff in the case Whitehat v. Landry. We're here with June Lorenzo of the International Indian Treaty Council, Marya Farah from Franciscans International, Gleckman, who's here representing the campaign to dismantle corporate power, and Joe Banner of the Descendants project will be joining us soon. I just want to thank the sponsors and co-hosts for the event, which is the International Indian Treaty Council, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, Franciscans International, the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. So I'll be your facilitator today. I'm Dominic Renfrey, Advocacy Program Manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights. I'm sorry if you tuned in to see the amazing Jen Falcon. Jen can't make it today because she's not well, so please send out your best wishes to Jen. So I'm excited for this event. I think it might be the first public event beyond the UN for our group, the U.S. Treaty Alliance. And for those who aren't too aware of the U.S. Treaty Alliance, we're a couple of years old, and we're a collaboration of representatives of Indigenous peoples and allied trade union, human rights, corporate accountability, and environmental organizations. The USTA aims to make the UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights as strong as it can be for frontline communities. In the process, the USTA is also drawing attention to the need for accountability now for human rights and environmental abuses occurring today at many sites of struggle across the US. Anyone interested in learning more about it can contact me directly, and I will put my details in the chat. Yeah, there we go. Great. So we're going to have a back and forth with the panelists here today, and then if you have questions, we'll get to those. So please put any questions in the chat if you have those by following the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And yeah, we'll get to those questions at the end when we have time. So just for some context for the event today, what is happening at the moment is the UN is negotiating a plastics treaty in Ottawa today, and that's where Joe Banner is and will be joining us from soon. At the same time, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is taking place in New York, and our panelists here have experience in that space as well. And many of us engage in the UN process to develop a treaty. And it occurred to us with all these UN spaces active that we shouldn't be divided by having so many UN spaces. We are advocates advancing human rights, environmental justice in many different spaces. And the questions that we want to get to today are, what are the common demands that movements can make in all these UN spaces? What are the consistent demands that we can advance in various different UN spaces? And what is the value and importance of those? Just for background on the US Treaty Alliance, we're supported by a growing number of elected US members of Congress. And we believe that the US government can be more supportive of the views of Indigenous peoples and other frontline communities at the UN treaty process in Geneva. This is really the reason why the US Treaty Alliance was formed, to push the US government to be more aligned with the views of frontline communities. For more information on the criticisms of the US government positions so far, you can see a letter that was sent by Representative Grijalva and other elected officials. The link is here in the chat. We don't want to spend too long there, but you can find more information about through that link. We just want to thank the U.S. Representative Grijalva for his leadership on this issue in the last few years. And we hope that many other representatives in Congress will join that position in supporting the positions of frontline communities. There's a lot of information there. I'm gonna now try and break that down a little bit. And I'm really delighted that Marya Farah is joining us. Marya is a representative of Franciscans International at the UN in New York. And for more information on the work of the Franciscans, you can find that here in the chat. Okay, Marya, thanks for being here. So there's a lot of information I shared there. And for people that are new to the UN process in Geneva, that is designing a treaty to regulate corporations for human rights abuses, can you provide a little bit of background for us about this initiative?
Sure. Thanks, Dom, and thank you to everybody that's joining us today. I think, as you said at the very beginning, the much larger backdrop is one of corporate impunity, where we've had the communities that we're from and that we work with continue to face injustices and impacts both personally and within the environment that they live in from businesses that are located in their area or nearby. And also seeing how businesses can often work with states or governments, local governments or national governments to work together to push forward specific objectives and can really wield a lot of power. So these issues have really long been recognized by the UN, and I want to, give a nod to you, who's been at the process since the very beginning in 2014, and also Harris, who we'll be hearing from later, that can give a much broader history of business accountability or attempts at accountability at the UN. But I'll start in 2011 when the UN Human Rights Council passed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So the UNGPs have 3 pillars, focusing on the state obligation to protect against human rights abuses by businesses, the business responsibility to respect human rights, and the rights remedy for those that are impacted. So after this was passed in 2011, states really got behind the UNGPs. Many of them issued national action plans to say how they were going to implement the UNGPs at a domestic level, and really continued to point to the UNGPs as the standard. Corporations also took the same approach, continually saying that they were going to abide by the UNGPs, incorporating them in their policies, or supposedly incorporating them in their policies. So even now, 13 years later, we continue to see states and businesses point to the UNGPs, including in the treaty process. So we had this continued essentially lip service by states and corporations, and then we had what we saw on the ground. And what happened was really immediately noticeable, where in practice, certain states, civil society, and others noticed that the UNGPs were not really changing anything on the ground. There were still human rights abuses, there was still environmental degradation, and it was all occurring in this vacuum of impunity. And really, essentially, that non-binding standards as the UNGPs are not enough. So in 2014, 3 years later, there was another resolution presented to the UN Human Rights Council by Ecuador, South Africa, Bolivia, Cuba. I may be missing a country, maybe Venezuela, I think, if I hadn't mentioned that, to establish a working group towards elaborating a legally binding instrument to regulate corporations under international human rights law. So again, this is towards binding regulations on states and on corporations. So since 2014, this year is the 10-year anniversary of that resolution, we've been in this process where there's a week-long session that's typically held in Geneva towards the end of October, where states are now negotiating on the text of a 4th draft on specific articles. And civil society also goes. We as the Treaty Alliance and the US Treaty Alliance go and also try to have our inputs heard by states and incorporated in the draft to make sure that the language is strong.
Thanks, Marya. I mean, it's not an easy task to summarize 13 years of advocacy, so I appreciate you walking us through that so clearly. Can you share what you think some of the elements of the treaty as it's currently drafted could be? Like, what are the best things in there to advance the demands of affected people?
Sure. So there are overarching elements on prevention and access to remedy. In regards to prevention, it's really focused on human rights due diligence processes where businesses are supposed to identify actual or potential human rights risks and adverse environmental impacts in their operations or activities that they could be involved in, or that they already are involved in if they've already begun these operations. So in the third draft of the LBI, in regards to human rights and the definition of human rights abuses, it included the human right to a healthy environment, which was just recently recognized in the past couple of years by the UN. And human rights due diligence also, the definition of it said that it should encompass environmental and climate change impacts. There was also language on situations of armed conflict, including situations of occupation, which noted that there should be heightened and ongoing due diligence in such situations. So these are just two very small parts of the human rights due diligence process. I think both of these elements on conflict and environment would be relevant for especially the group that we're with today. So Joe will be speaking on the Plastics Treaty and environmental degradation more generally. One of the co-sponsors of this webinar is the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. So discussing how conflict and situations of occupation are furthered by businesses. Importantly, this language was generally removed from the fourth draft. So again, it's an ongoing process and ongoing back and forth. Other elements that are really important to consider are situations where it's impossible to mitigate human rights abuses. So a business should really not be going in because whatever they do, the situation is so sensitive or their operations would be so harmful that really they just shouldn't be going into it or beginning operations. Another element, which maybe we'll hear more from with June, is the right to free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous populations and communities, including respecting the right to say no. So we don't have that phrase of respecting the right to say no to projects in the draft, but we do have the principle of FPIC generally. Otherwise, in regards to access to remedy, which is really, you know, the heart of the LBI, because unfortunately, I think we all know that even if this is in place and businesses do conduct human rights due diligence, there'll still be abuses and environmental degradation. So how can impacted communities have some sort of recourse or redress to their rights? So there are specific articles on jurisdiction, articles regarding burden of proof and a dynamic burden of proof, where you don't place all of the weight on communities when corporations obviously have so much power and influence to not just hide, but not be transparent in what they have been doing. And also articles in regards to statute of limitations so that individuals can bring cases once the harm is known. So this is also important for cases of like intergenerational harm, especially in environmental context. So again, we're on the fourth draft and we've seen language come and go that's been valuable for us as activists and human rights defenders. And it really kind of highlights why we need to continue with the process.
Thanks so much, Marya. Yeah, this process is trying to encapsulate regulation of corporations in every context, which is such a massive scope. And thank you for summarizing that there. And you mentioned June Lorenzo there. June, it'd be great to bring you in to discuss a little bit more about some of this. You of course, Laguna Pueblo of the Diné Nation and a consultant with the International Indian Treaty Council. And I'll put the link in the chat to IITC in a second. But you've engaged at the UN Permanent Forum for several years. I think this year you're not able to be there, but you have experience in that space, and you've also been in the UN treaty in October that we have every year to regulate corporations in those negotiations. And what do you see as some of the common demands being voiced by Indigenous peoples in these UN spaces?
Oops. Okay, am I unmuted?
You're good, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, I guess, because we're on Eastern Standard Time. Thanks to all the co-sponsors for doing this really important webinar on something, unfortunately, that has not gotten nearly the attention it deserves. So in terms of demands by Indigenous peoples, very much, since 2007, when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the UN General Assembly, Indigenous peoples have worked hard to mainstream the standards. And of course, some of the basics are the right to self-determination. And with this right to self-determination and the right to make decisions about our own territory, to have our territories, ancestral territories, sacred spaces and landscapes and sites respected, in the face of a lot of development, is the right to free, prior, and informed consent. I want to draw a distinction that's really important, and it's one of the things that's highlighted at this year's permanent forum. A lot of people have been conflating the term, and I never use the word Indigenous population, so I just want to correct the use of that term. So the 3 UN mechanisms have issued advice against conflating Indigenous peoples and local communities. 2 entirely different groups, although there might be some crossover. Indigenous populations, or Indigenous peoples, I'm sorry, local communities might be covered under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. They might be covered under the rights of minorities. But we maintain that Indigenous peoples have really distinct rights. And so with Article 3 and all the articles on free, prior, and informed consent, those are really, really critical articles because, I don't think it's any secret that by far transnational corporations' violations of human rights impact Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' territory. So the demands all center around recognition of those rights. And I might add that UN bodies like CERD, like the HRC, have made findings and recommendations that in complying with existing conventions, they really need to apply the standards outlined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you so much, and appreciate all the wisdom of experience that you have of engaging in these spaces. I know IITC follows international spaces very closely. As it relates to the UN process to negotiate the treaty in Geneva, how do you think the US could improve its role in those negotiations? I mean, I shared the link earlier to the letter that Representative Grijalva has sent critiquing their position. And for people who want to see that, please check in the chat. But what do you think are some of the ways that the US could actually could play a better role in those processes?
Well, first of all, they could listen to their constituents and members of Congress. As many of us know, the US didn't participate for many years, and up until very recently, they had a very strong position against a legally binding treaty. And so now they're not quite saying that, but their actions certainly say otherwise. Marya was talking about the negotiation process. And one of the things that the US representatives have done, which is really frustrating, not only for civil society and Indigenous peoples, but for other states who take these negotiations seriously, is really dumping lots of text during the negotiations. That's a common tactic for slowing down the process. And so, dumping a lot of language, also using indirect means to slow the process, We know that by and large, the United States really prefers voluntary standards, which is, of course, really informed by corporations. The folks who do corporate capture work can tell you in much greater detail how that happens in our country. I also work, I'll be going to the negotiations for the World Intellectual Property Organization, and of course, major pharmaceuticals. So it's not just extractive companies, which is what I pay a lot of attention to, but there are lots of transnational corporations that have huge influence on the US government, and they don't even need to be in the negotiation room. And that's what's really frustrating. They can have impact without even being in the room. So for the US, it would be, I know that we've approached UN representatives. Really, it's just is really listen to civil society and constituents, American citizens who are getting informed about this because, they're the ones who put the administration in place. The last time I checked, corporations don't get to vote or place a ballot in the ballot box. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you so much, June. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you touching on the corporate capture element of all this, right? The power that companies are really exercising over these decision-making spaces. And for any Indigenous representatives interested in joining us at the Treaty Alliance here, please contact me. I've put the email address in there. I just want to shout out June, who's done work over the years to try and bring more Indigenous communities into this treaty space. We're hoping to build out the caucus of Indigenous representatives in the treaty space. So please come and join us. We're very nice people. We'd love to have you.
Dom, I just want to do a shout out. I happen to be at Swarthmore College. It's one of the reasons I'm not at Permanent Forum, at a symposium that's put on. I want to shout out a film. It's entitled Powerlands, and it was done by Ivy Camille Many Beats So, and that is a powerful depiction of how transnationals have impacted Indigenous peoples around the world. And so in this process, we're talking about the US, but we're really talking about impact on Indigenous peoples in every continent. So I want to give a shout out to that film, which is being one of the things featured at this symposium this weekend.
Great. We'll pull up the link to that and put it into the chat. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Continuing on the theme of corporate capture, Joe, thanks for making it here. I know that you are in the heat of negotiations there in Ottawa at the UN Plastics Treaty, another treaty that's going on. And you also join us in Geneva for the Treaty on Business and Human Rights. So you're a busy person in these UN spaces these days. Joe Banner is the co-founder and co-director of the Descendants project based in the river parishes in Louisiana. I'm going to put a link to Joe's fantastic organization in the chat in just a moment. Here we are. Great. So, Joe, you're involved in both the plastics treaty process, the treaty process in Geneva on business and human rights. And when you're involved in UN work, you're really advancing the work of your community, really, on the front lines in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. But it would be fascinating for us to hear your experience of how you see corporations using their power locally in the river parishes, but again, also globally in these plastics treaty processes to manipulate decision-making. Can you share a little bit of your experience there and how you see that playing out?
Yes, thanks, Dom, and thanks for being patient with me as I switch from one panel to the other. Yeah, I am for this treaty, for the plastics treaty, information or some research came out that was produced by Center for International Environmental Law, or CL. The report showed that there are 192 industry people here in the treaty talks. And industry, I mean fossil fuel, plastic producers, what have you. I think that's more than the actual European delegates who are participating in the process. It shows you the corporate capture. But a lot of people are, of course, it is shocking to see the involvement of industry, but I'm also thinking at home, this is nothing. This is really just what we wake up to every day. We go to sleep to these industry representatives are in our government, they're in our schools, they're in our churches, they're on our playgrounds. So it's just the clutching of the pearls right now shows me how bad it really is at home, to where it's kind of like, I mean, this is what we go through every day. So I like to stress when I'm in these type of the importance of really what we face on the fence line and how crisis that's happened. It's international colliding and either putting more pollution in our communities or exporting it or importing it, no matter what, it's still impacting us. So just being in these talks, it pains me to be away from home. I'm actually always so stressed because I'm like, I should be home and I need to be doing what something or whatever. But really being in this space is important because I know that I can at least talk to the world. I have access to the world through the treaty space.
So what do you think should be some common demands made of the US government when it is in these UN spaces? What is the most important thing that they should be doing on behalf of fence-line communities?
We need a centering on human rights. The zero draft that came out for this treaty has no mention of human rights. So I think it all starts there. And it's funny because I work in the plastics treaty and also on the human rights side with you, Dom, and you're bringing me into that world. And it's such a split between the two treaties that you would think they would go hand in hand. Almost one could fit underneath the other, but they're separate. And even the talking points are, at least on the plastic side, the removal of human rights, so that we're having to advocate for human rights and environmental justice and stopping environmental racism. It's really it's impactful to see those spaces. So really wanting to have people-centered solutions and people-centered conversation and negotiations. And we don't see that right now. Now we're seeing plastics being pulled apart by the chemical, taking 5 chemicals out of 16,000 that are toxic and thinking we're making progress. That's because it's just so focused on the numbers and the statistics, which are important. But if you don't have that grounding in humanity, then we are not going to have the progress that we desperately need.
I just want people to understand, Joe, just because in the Business and Human Rights Treaty, there's really strong demands for controlling corporate capture. There's actually a provision in the treaty text itself that actually controls corporate influence in policy making spaces. But in the treaty space that you're in now, the plastics treaty space, it's just infiltrated with corporate representatives. Is that right? You're seeing, you've told me in the past, something like hundreds of corporations there. Is that right?
Yeah, 192 for this one. It was 136 for the last negotiation. So now we're up to 192. And we're also, keep in mind that some of these companies are coming, but they're also part of those bigger lobbying firms that are here, such as the ACC, which represents multiple fossil fuel companies in production and producers. Yeah, it's disturbing. It's growing, and we have been asking them to kick industry out. I mean, imagine your problem is so bad that you have to have a treaty in order to address it. That's a pretty bad problem. The fact that you can have these people who created the problem walk into space and do so boldly and with so much audacity and not put any ramifications for it shows you the power that they have over this process.
Thank you, Joe. And all power to you. Thank you for taking the fight locally, nationally, globally. We're all there with you in spirit this week. And you touched on something around trade, the trade lobby groups. And I want to turn to Anne. Thank you so much, Joe. Anne White Hat is a member of the Aske Diapspaye clan of the Lakota Oyate. I'm pretty sure I destroyed the pronunciation of that, and please help me out there when you speak in a moment. And you have a pretty incredible story that I don't think enough people know about. I mean, you and the water protectors in Southwest Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana, have been targeted, really, like deliberately targeted by corporate trade associations. I mean, we're talking here about the American Legislative Exchange Council, right? And the way that they manipulated Louisiana law to put a target on your back. And you've been trying to chase away these charges on you for years. But I wanted to back up and just sort of check in with you. And for people that haven't really followed what happened, can you walk us through sort of how that attack unfurled on you? And so that we can sort of hear a little bit about that experience.
Yes, thanks, Dom. Thanks, y'all, for having me here today. Midaku yapi, chante washte nape chuzapi. Ohitika we miena and white hat machapiksto. I'm from the Ashke Guipi Tioshpae from the Sichangui Lakota Nation, located in the occupied lands, the occupied territories in South Dakota. I live here in South Louisiana for 14 years now with my family, and I own a business down here, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Louis Lavino Bayou Bridge Pipeline Resistance Camp, which we started as a camp as a resistance to the continuation of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is Bayou Bridge is basically the tail end of the Black Snake, as it were. So we target, that was a targeted campaign for us because, for me personally, because of the attack that they did on my relatives up north. So I was happy to join the campaign. And the assault against our camp was really a targeted effort, like Dom mentioned, between, I guess we called it lawfare at one point, okay? We called it lawfare, which is basically groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, working in conjunction, in partnership with the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association and state legislatures here in the state of Louisiana to target us, to criminalize basically our First Amendment rights to protest and criminalize us very deeply. In 2018, they drafted the law to, and it was an amendments. What they did was they drafted amendments to the state's critical infrastructure law. And what the amendment stated was that pipeline infrastructure became critical infrastructure in the state of Louisiana. Now that is very, very troublesome. And I think everybody in the state of Louisiana should know how dangerous this law is, because the state of Louisiana, as you know, is oil and gas country. We have about 128,000 miles of pipeline infrastructure zigzagging all through the state. So at any time, anybody walking, we have landowners who have pipelines going through their property. They're in the bayous, they're in the Atchafalaya Basin. So at any point, a person, like right now, at this moment, people are all over critical infrastructure and have no idea. And so that's one of the dangers of this, is that you can be on this critical infrastructure. You don't know that if you're on this critical infrastructure. And then state actors who are enforcing this law can come in there and arrest you, and you don't even know why so they can basically target you and your movement under this law. It's a very arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement, and it's very broad in the way that it is meant to chill our constitutionally protected speech. And also, the very punitive parts of this are that it brought previously misdemeanor charges for trespassing on critical infrastructure. They brought those in and changed that to felonies, okay? Facing 10, I had two charges at one point, facing up to 10 years here in prison here, doing hard labor in the state of Louisiana. The case is called White Hat versus Landry, and the Center for Constitutional Rights has taken up the case on our behalf. And as you know, maybe you don't know now, but at the time, Landry was our Attorney General, and he is now the governor of the state of Louisiana, and working very diligently and hard to continue to suppress our rights through the state legislature as we speak. So this is why I'm here. This is why I'm here to tell the story of what happened to us. We have very detailed reporting on this, which also targeted media presence. We had one of the plaintiffs is a reporter who was covering our work out there, and she was also arrested along with a former military member who came to join and help us. We were all targeted and arrested, and so we're here today. And so this is why I'm here to talk about and to share my experience, because this is really at the crux, I feel like, at the crux of what we're talking about, and one of the ways of corporate capture, and the way that these private industries, these private corporate interest groups are able to work with, and this is nothing new, okay? Like in Indian country, we call it Indian country, we faced targeted repression for hundreds of years now, okay? It's always been a way for a land grab. Now there's a way for grabbing our natural resources. And also just
Absolutely.
trying to chill our work.
Thank you, Anne. It's been a pleasure to be working alongside you for years. And one thing I just want to tell everyone that has always stuck in my mind, well, many things you said are stuck in my mind, but one of them was, why can't people just see that critical infrastructure is the rivers and the land and the air and the water? And it's always stuck with me. It's such a perversion of actually what is the true critical infrastructure. And thank you for just fighting on for so long. I've put links to your profile in the chat there too, but you take your fight into the UN space as well, right? We've been together in Geneva, pushing on the US. Can you tell us what do you see as some of those key demands that we should be pushing for loud and consistently when we're in these UN spaces? What are the most important things to you?
Well, I think you mentioned one of them in terms of our critical infrastructure and what we value as our critical to the continuation of life on Mother Earth. Okay, water. Okay, we need to protect our water resources, and in our particular instance here, that's what we were fighting for, was to protect the water resources. And so I think it's important for us to really focus and talk about the environmental desecration and ramifications of corporate capture. What does that mean for us to have clean water, and the impacts that those struggles that we're doing? What is the impact to our frontline communities that are directly impacted by this? Because those folks who are making these laws, who are involved in developing these things, they are not at the tap. They are not at our tap water. They are not turning on the water that is ultimately going to be contaminated.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne. Now, I want to just remind folks, if you're watching, to please put any questions you have for any of the panelists into the chat. We were happy to have a conversation about any of that afterwards. We've got one final speaker. I'm delighted to have Harris here. Harris Gleckman is an active member of the global campaign to dismantle corporate power. I'm going to put a link in the chat in a moment so that people can actually find out a little bit more what the global campaign is and what it's up to. Harris, you've been involved in UN spaces for quite some time, and you've seen the comings and goings of corporations and what they're doing to our world through the UN. So what do you believe are some of the key lessons we can draw from the experiences that people have been sharing? What are the things that we can make us better advocates in these spaces?
Okay.
Yeah.
Dom and all the other organizers, thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. Yes, as Anne was saying, struggles about corporations have been going on for a very long time. And my own activity is only from the 1970s. Others, including Anne's, descriptions have been going on for centuries before that. It's a little bit hard to follow Anne's presentation, to step back and look at some of the tensions that could be brought to the fore and lessons we might learn from prior activities. As Dom was indicating, I worked at the Center on Transnational Corporations around their effort to a code of conduct. I've watched the ups and downs of the OECD's effort to have a convention and their guidelines, and the International Chamber of Commerce's guidelines. And so this battle, that at least the portion of which I've watched, has been going on for about 50 years. But I think one of the things which I'd like to say is that we can draw a lot from what we accept as necessary in northern democracies and in southern democracies about what should happen within our countries, because at the international level, many of these features disappear. And I'm talking about, in this area, that domestically we have civil liabilities, we have procedures for dealing with civil suits, we have criminal law, and we have procedures for dealing with breaking crimes. We have administrative law and administrative structures. And what happens when you don't follow an administrative order? But when you go on to the international level, none of this exists. And I want to pick up a little on Marya's introduction and concentrate on the element of the gap in cross-border liabilities. And this gap is one of the crucial elements that the binding treaty is trying to fix. And we accept it, and the governments accept it within their own countries, that there is multiple avenues for resolving disputes. But at the international level, that doesn't happen. Firms have managed to be able to have free movement of capital, free movement of currencies, almost free movement of a lot of natural resources out of countries, movement for executives to go in and out of countries. But cross-border liability, the gap is being defended and closed. So what are some of the features that need to be fixed? Probably I'll share three to give you an indication of what needs to be addressed. As you've heard from June, there's voluntary standards. The concept of voluntarism is embedded in current international practice, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work at national levels to say you have voluntary criminal laws, that you have voluntary civil laws, that the administrative law system, when some have a rule, you say, oh, it's only voluntary. This presumption at the international level of voluntarism weakens any avenue for resolving conflicts, for setting effective standards, for giving any guidance to how to resolve gaps. Let's take one of those gaps, fact-finding. If you're in a country in Latin America, you have a dispute. One of the key elements in any industrialized countries is discovery, where you can reach out by rule, by procedure, by court order, to gain knowledge that you can use in your court case. But if you're sitting in Guatemala and the evidence is in Italy, all you can do is say, please send me something. I need it for my court case. And guess what? That voluntaristic approach is very convenient for the firms, because Italy can say, thank you, we just received your letter, and that's the end of the conversation. The rules for how a criminal proceeding in Guatemala could draw on the criminal arrangements in the industrialized countries for support, or civil liabilities efforts in Guatemala could connect in to multiple civil law systems in other countries. They are what we're trying to put in this binding treaty to address the cross-border liability gap. One other element is on enforcement. Ecuador's had major cases decided in Ecuador, decided even in US courts, Bhopal. And when even there's a decision, the TNC can say, that was nice to hear your voice, because there's no requirement that they actually have to be implemented. And so this voluntary underpinning is used to, even once there's a successful court action, to preclude the effective settlement redress, at least in financial terms. So this gap has a lot of business advantages. And I'd like to identify that there are really 5 types of obstacles at the moment I see affecting a conclusion of the binding treaty. First is the one that you've been hearing me talk about, is the presumption of voluntarism. We have to move to what we accept at national level, that there are some in civil and in administrative and in criminal obligatory relations. Second is that there are major negotiations going on elsewhere to support the gap being widened. So you have discussions in an organization called Ancestral based in Vienna, who is looking at the dispute settlement process that exists, which is obligatory. Foreign investors can go to this process and sue countries who enact more humane laws, more environmental laws, which may have restricted potential profits. And now they're trying to institutionalize this at a higher level. We also have negotiations going on at the World Trade Organization under the Services Agreement and under investment promotion agreements to widen the space of accountability. And then there is the OECD's continuing voluntary guidelines, which are presented as one of the many solutions. So that's one where there are multiple platforms continuing to work to keep or widen the ability to have accountability. Another type of obstacle, which is more common in the Human Rights Council, is that the chair of the process controls the pen. In the early days, the Ecuadorian government, and therefore the Ecuadorian ambassador in Geneva, was very much concerned to build this kind of binding treaty. Subsequently, the government has changed in Ecuador, and their ambassadors are less interested, or actually maybe in opposition. And so when you've been hearing on the panel is that some text goes in and some text goes out, they're talking about the centrality of the ambassador who controls the pen. in the negotiation process. Another type of obstacle is one which we've been hearing about from June and Anne, is that those who have a financial benefit for not recognizing liability, or not who want the current system to continue, be it in the plastics area or in more generally liabilities areas, are in the room saying, we can create as many obstacles, many legal questions to create blockages. And so the types of obstacles range from the presumption of voluntarism, the intrusion of firms and countries speaking on their behalf to maintain or expand the arrangements, competing negotiations and other forms to limit the options for effective rules of law, and the functioning of the chair. So the commitment of many people, and it's wonderful to listen to the commitment to the process, is why there's a global campaign on corporate capture and of the processes and corporate capture of international law that could help resolve issues of people who have been harmed and prevent further harms. Thank you again for inviting me to join this discussion.
Thank you so much, Harris. And also, I know, Harris, you've been working on a new initiative that's coming through the UN, which is a little concerning, called the Summit for the Future. I'm going to put into the chat a link to a paper that I'm sure that you were involved in, but it's summarizing some of the concerns there. So please, people, I encourage you to take a look at that. There'll be a gathering in New York in September. Is that right, Harris? And can you explain to us briefly, Harris, like what is the conceptual concern with what the UN is trying to advance with this summit? What's the pivot it's trying to make concrete about the way the UN operates?
Yes, thanks, Dom. I think that there are two major issues to think about. When the Secretary General opened the discussion for a summit for the future, a fantastic title, he was proposing that the conference for this summit should be multi-stakeholder led. And he also was proposing 6 other multi-stakeholder led events. And in this context, it means that the TNCs in those areas who are interested are amongst those central to the table. And so the Secretary General is proposing a form of corporate capture to be recognized as okay within multilateralism. Fortunately, the Group of 77 in China were very clear that this form of corporate capture was unacceptable. But the push from the Secretary General's office, from his high-level advisors, and from some of the OECD countries is to legitimate transnational corporations being inside the global governance system in bigger ways. So we're fortunately able to say, by some very good lobbying and support across the global South, both from civil society in the South and in the North, that's been constrained. So now the Summit for the Future is an intergovernmental-led event. The other side is what's the change about the access of civil society to the intergovernmental process and to individual governments in trying to scope what the future framework should be. And when the Sustainable Development Goals were developed, civil society and government sat in the same room. They spoke in different order, but they all participated, and the governments of the Global South are very happy with the outcome of the scope of the Sustainable Development Goals. in the Summit for the Future, they're trying to so-called innovate new ways, but the effect of what they're doing in spite of their language is to further marginalize civil society's ability to meet with, talk with, participate, have their views heard by governments. Two features of this, Dom. One is that they use co-facilitators who meet periodically with civil society for 2-4 hours, and then give a 10-minute summary to the governments. Second is an event that they are deciding that will happen in a couple of weeks, is to convene civil society. But where? 6,000 miles away in Nairobi, to talk amongst themselves. And that in that way, they're supposed to be able to influence the future. And this distancing, this increasing marginalization of bringing in, when you say civil society, in one way, the UN has 21 different communities who are recognized as major groups, who have distinct contributions, as Anne was saying, in terms of indigenous peoples, or others were saying too. All of those are being pushed out of the platform to relate to the defining the future. But
Well,
in the contradictions of the time, one of the outcomes of this event will be a declaration about future generations. So,
Harris, you leave us in the exact place we started, which I appreciate. That strong UN advocacy is frontline-led advocacy. And if we are not attentive to what we're seeing around us, the access and opportunity for affected people, representative of indigenous nations, everyone else in between is going to be completely pushed out. So please stay alert and aware. Please stay engaged. We're running out of time. I want to just respect the ASL interpreters so that we don't go over. A big thank you to you, Harris, Marya, Anne, June, Joe in the background. A shout out to Amanda in the Center for Constitutional Rights team. Both Lavender and Sarika are ASL interpreters. Thank you so much. To Jen Falcon, who's not well, was meant to facilitate today, who's in Istanbul. We're all sending you a speedy recovery. I'll just put in the chat one more time for anyone who is interested in learning more about the US Treaty Alliance, please contact me in the email that's in the chat there. A huge thanks to everyone who was involved. Have a great rest of your day and be well. Thank you so much.